As long as there is demand for drugs, the battle to supply the users will continue. I spoke to Mexico's Attorney General. I asked him if that was the case, what was the real objective of Mexico's war on the drug cartels?
The objective for our country is to raise the opportunity cost of Mexico, and together with Mexico, Central America, as a route of supplying drugs into the largest market in the world. This is a very complex phenomenon. There are emerging markets elsewhere. For instance, the most attractive market for cocaine today in the world is not the US in terms of prices. It is Europe. Europe pays, even with the strong dollar, a much higher price than the US wholesale for cocaine. You're not going to hear from me an argument in terms of legalizing drugs across the board.
Is it because your hands are tied? We've talked to former government officials who say, look, if we did this, the US would punish Mexico.
I have been working on this problem for 8 years now. What I have to say here is there is no way that a single country can change the understanding of the world around this problem. What we can do is put every single mean in our reach, at our hand, to meet our objective, which is to raise Mexico's opportunity cost as a route or as a production area for any drug, and therefore
push it to another country.
Whatever. It is important that we remove the power from these groups in our country to recover fully the right of Mexicans to live in peace, which has been, in a way, kidnapped, seized in certain geographical areas which are highly relevant for Mexico. This is the commitment of President Calderon before the Mexican people.
The Mexican Attorney General is firm in his belief then that decriminalization is not the answer. But a chorus of former world leaders and of those who served on the front line of the war on drugs are arguing that a rethink is urgently needed, including one former agent who policed the border area where we're standing right now.
Marijuana is higher THC now than it was in the beginning, and as well as cocaine is purer, cheaper, and more of it than it was 30 years ago when I first started working here. So that, to me, is a sign of failure. The policy's not working, because if it were working, then we would be catching less and less drugs, and we would have less and less drug use in America, which we all know is not the case.
But I mean, everyone can see that, though. But I mean,
well, you would think everyone could see it, but we at LEAP, of course, we think we see it, and we're calling for a system of regulation and control of narcotics, is who can buy them and who can sell them, to stop drug gangs from selling them to kids in school grounds and stuff, and then quit treating our drug problem as a criminal problem and treat it as a social ill and a medical ill instead of a criminal problem. And by doing that, we can take about 80% of the crime and violence out of the drug trade and basically put the cartels out of business.
What would some of your former colleagues, though, say? What did your colleagues say when you pointed this out when you were in law enforcement, that, hang on, maybe this isn't working, maybe we should talk about this a bit more creatively or honestly?
Well, the one time that sticks out in my mind was the guy from D.C. told me that, Agent Nelson, you don't make policy, you carry it out, which was a true statement. I was paid by the government to carry out their policy, not paid to implement, to make the policy. So he was right. Now I'm trying to change that policy.
But the culture of the crackdown of punishment, we still hear that. I mean, it's all spoken of. Hillary Clinton, for example, has recently said that we're part of this problem, but her solution was to say, so we're going to give Mexico 4 more Black Hawks, helicopters. I mean, is that the way forward? That's still the crackdown, isn't it?
Well, if you've lived around here as long as I have, this is not the first time we've given Mexico helicopters. This will be the first time we've given them Black Hawk helicopters, and I'm sure Sikorsky really appreciates business. But we gave them Huey helicopters 20-some-odd years ago, many of them, and within a few years they were just cannibalized for parts, and they had very few of them left running. It was a waste of our money, time, and effort, and I'm afraid it's the same thing now. We must recognize that the policy we've been using isn't working, and so let's try something different. Let's try a new policy, or at least modify the policy, and try to get something that works instead of continuing for another 40 years what hasn't worked in the last 40 years.
Mexico's government remains committed to a military response to the problem, but its critics say it's very clear that the authorities must directly target what the cartels value most: their money.
This is the driving force. Tens of billions of dollars a year that Mexican cartels are earning from trafficking illegal drugs. No one knows just how much drug money is pouring in from the United States, considered by far the world's biggest market for illegal drugs. But huge profits earned across the border are being brought back into Mexico, stuffed in suitcases, trucks, and airplanes. That money is then being laundered, often in the simplest ways.
Anyone can walk in off the street, exchange their dollars for pesos, and they remain virtually untraceable. For that reason, federal agents are stepping up their investigations into the role money exchange houses play in money laundering crimes. And judges are currently prosecuting at least 3 major cases against such financial institutions.
No industry appears to be immune. Mexico's all-important tourism sector is now being used to launder drug money, hundreds of millions of dollars a year, according to experts. This, as an untold amount of so-called dirty money, also makes its way into other parts of Mexico's more mainstream economy.
78% of economic sectors, legal sectors in Mexico, have been infiltrated by organized crime. So you have a problem that has become worse, and these are not just perceptional indicators. These are objective indicators of organized crime activity.
It's a regional phenomenon, with drug traffickers using illegal funds to pay off their South American cocaine suppliers and Mexican suppliers who produce vast amounts of heroin and marijuana, and also to purchase the heavy weapons, assault rifles and grenades the cartels use while battling government security forces and rival drug gangs vying for control of lucrative shipping routes into the United States. The profits are also going to bribe corrupt government officials who trade protection for payments. Some say following that money trail could lead to some very uncomfortable places, including the offices of Mexico's leading decision makers.
Of course, businessmen, governors, mayors, people from the political parties, candidates.
Mexican government officials admit they're fully aware of the financial power that drug traffickers use to keep their highly profitable businesses alive.
The problem of corruption is our biggest challenge. It diminishes our institutions and harms the work of combating money laundering by facilitating illegal activities.
Mexican legislators are now reviewing a government proposal that would reform money laundering laws. It includes a measure allowing officials to seize properties and bank accounts belonging to alleged drug traffickers. But some worry the law could be used by corrupt officials against their political foes. Introducing such measures and sending more soldiers to regions affected by drug violence might address the symptoms, but not the root causes. Some say it's time for the government to begin seriously confronting drug cartels by treating them as criminal business enterprises.
The Colombian war on drugs displaced the drug cartels north to Mexico. It's yet to be seen what Mexico's war on drugs will achieve, but it does seem unlikely that the cartels will desert an industry that's so lucrative, no matter how deadly it may be. I spoke with one former Mexican government minister. I asked him what he thought of the current government's strategy.
The first thing that comes to my mind is that I've read these headlines before. Over the last 25 to 30 years, I've read pretty much the same stories written by pretty much the same correspondents with the same nonsense largely in them, and the same response by the American authorities in response to those headlines, and then by the Mexican authorities to the American authorities. This is a movie that we've all seen before. It's like Rocky 1, Rocky 2, Rocky 3, and then Rocky Balboa. We've all been there.
But then why is President Calderon allowing himself to be sucked into this usual cycle of affairs?
Well,
what's he up to? Because it is having an impact on the ground. People are dying.
People are dying. There's a lot more violence than there was before, yes.
And if it's purely there as part of a cycle of rhetoric with the U.S., I mean, that's very serious. Then why would he do it? Why is it in his best benefit?
Well, I think firstly because he doesn't know that it's a cycle. If he wasn't around in the 60s or 70s or 80s or 90s, or the 90s he was, but before then he wasn't, and he is not someone who has a particularly strong sense of history. The second is that he declared a war of choice. If Bush's war in Iraq was a war of choice, Calderon's war on drugs is a war of choice. He wasn't ready. He wasn't. It was an improvised, precipitous decision.
Well, because of the close fought election and so on.
Yes, I mean, he did this. It was a decision he made 10 or 15 days before he took office and 10 days after he took office. It's a war of choice, which I think was a mistake, and now we're paying the consequences of that mistake.
I mean, you were in government, obviously. Surely the drug issue does have to be dealt with some way. Are there not more sort of, I don't know, more rational, more thoughtful approaches being discussed at the very least?
Well, it has to be dealt with, but what is it you want to deal with? Do you want to deal with the violence? You want to deal with the corruption? You want to deal with the penetration by the drug cartels into the state mechanism? Or do you really think that you're going to eradicate or abolish drug trafficking and drug consumption in the world? I think if that's your goal, it's a totally futile and ridiculous goal. If what they want to do is reduce the violence, reduce the corruption, reduce the political penetration, that's a different issue. And that is achievable.
Isn't it, in the end, isn't the reality for Calderon is hoping for some sort of equilibrium at some point, where, and almost by necessity picking a cartel or two, hoping that they settle things down a bit with equilibrium, and then everything quietens down a bit, as long as the major issue of consumption and so on in the US is not being dealt with.
I am not convinced, frankly, that it's a good idea for Mexico to insist so much on Americans reducing their demand. If I were an American citizen, which I'm not, and if I lived in the United States, which I do partly, I'd say no. On the contrary, do harm reduction, do legalization of certain drugs for certain purposes.
Now, you're saying this in a way that so many other people who've formerly been in government do discuss this issue in a very kind of rational, look, let's just cut the nonsense here. This is the problem, this is the solution, why don't we just do that? Why didn't you say that while you were in government? Why didn't Zedillo, why didn't President Gaviria, why didn't all these other presidents who are now coming out saying that, say it while they were in office? The answer is clear, everyone knows it, and yet when they're in office, they just won't deal with this issue.
You're absolutely right. There are two reasons. The first is that no Latin American president or minister can get away with saying something like that if the United States isn't willing to go along with it, and so far the United States has not been willing, and so consequently nobody will be caught dead saying it in office. So you can't say it or mean it or do anything unless the Americans go along with it. What's changing are two things. First of all, the United States has an increasingly different point of view, and perhaps President Obama and his new drug czar will also begin to change their point of view. But I think he's going to adopt a much more health-oriented approach than a criminal war on drugs approach. The big question then is, what should President Calderon, who is in office, do? Instead of insisting on this notion of reducing and combating drugs in the U.S., I think he should insist on the U.S. adopting a health-based, a public health-based, harm reduction-based, management and regulation-based approach, which is not going to reduce probably U.S. demand, but it's going to bring it out from the shadows.
That's all for this news special. We'll continue to bring you the latest on Mexico in the Crossfire, here on Al Jazeera.